In the bustling city of Amersworth, where the streets bustled with life and ambition, lived a man named Julian Gray. At 30 years old, Julian had become accustomed to living on the edge. His striking good looks, easy charm, and sharp wit had often afforded him the opportunity to float through life, rarely needing to work too hard for anything. He had a way with people, particularly women, and could effortlessly charm his way into their hearts, at least for a time. But for all his allure and easy charisma, Julian lacked direction. He bounced from job to job, from brief romance to brief romance, never finding satisfaction, never quite able to plant his feet in something lasting. One cool autumn evening, Julian found himself at his favorite cafe, a small, cozy nook tucked away from the more affluent parts of the city. It was a place where he could observe the comings and goings of people, where the city's elite sometimes passed through, and where he could listen. On this particular night, Julian sat alone with his lukewarm coffee, staring out the window, when he overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two older gentlemen, well-dressed and clearly part of the city's upper class, sat at the table next to him, their voices low but distinct enough for Julian's sharp ears to pick up. They were discussing a woman, Evelyn Hargrave. Julian had heard the name before. Evelyn was something of a legend in the city. A fabulously wealthy widow who had been married to one of the most successful industrialists of the previous generation. Since her husband's passing, Evelyn had become reclusive, living alone in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. She was said to be in her early 60s now, still beautiful, elegant, and mysterious, with a fortune that most could only dream of. Julian leaned in a little closer, feigning interest in his coffee, as the men continued their discussion. "She's still hosting those extravagant parties," one of them said. "But hardly anyone gets close to her anymore. A real enigma, that one. I heard she's incredibly lonely." The other man nodded. "A fortune like that and no one to share it with. Tragic, really. If only someone could win her over." Julian's mind began to spin. This was it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He could picture it clearly, himself, effortlessly charming his way into Evelyn's life, into her heart, and ultimately into her fortune. All he needed was a plan, a way to meet her, to get close to her. And to make her trust him. That night, Julian didn't sleep. Instead, he lay awake in his small apartment, strategizing. He knew from his own limited social circles that Evelyn was still an avid art collector and often visited the exclusive gallery in the heart of the city every Thursday. That would be his entry point. Julian was confident that his charm, looks, and intelligence would carry him the rest of the way. On Thursday morning, Julian dressed with precision. He chose a tailored jacket that exuded casual sophistication, a crisp white shirt, and loafers polished just enough to give him an air of affluence without seeming too eager. He styled his hair carefully and made sure to practice his opening lines in the mirror. "It's all about the approach," he told himself. "She won't know what hit her." When he arrived at the gallery, Julian's heart raced, but he kept his cool. The gallery was quiet, with only a handful of visitors scattered throughout the spacious, marble-floored halls. Julian pretended to admire a large painting of a stormy seascape when he saw her, Evelyn Hargrave. She stood across the room, gazing thoughtfully at a sculpture in the center of the gallery. Even from a distance, Julian could tell she was everything the rumors had said, graceful, elegant, and commanding a presence that seemed to make the very air around her hum with energy. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a fitted, deep blue dress that accentuated her slender frame. Julian took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Julian made his approach, walking slowly but purposefully toward the sculpture Evelyn was admiring. As he neared her, he pretended to study it for a moment, then spoke in a soft, admiring tone. "It's quite something, isn't it? The way the artist captures such stillness in the stone, yet you can almost feel the emotion radiating from it." Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze settling on Julian. For a brief moment, she studied him, her deep green eyes betraying a lifetime of wisdom and experience. Julian held her gaze, flashing his most charming, disarming smile. "It is," Evelyn replied, her voice calm and measured. "But what I find more fascinating is the story behind the piece. Do you know it?" Julian had done his research. He nodded, effortlessly recounting the history of the sculpture, weaving in a few witty remarks that made Evelyn's lips curve into a faint smile. As the conversation flowed, Julian could feel the connection forming. She was sharp, engaging, and far more captivating than he had anticipated. But that only fueled his determination. After a few more minutes of light conversation, Evelyn glanced at her watch and sighed. "I'm afraid I must be going," she said. "But it was a pleasure speaking with you." "Julian, was it?" Julian smiled warmly. "The pleasure was all mine, Evelyn." Her eyebrow arched slightly. "I didn't realize I had introduced myself." Julian chuckled softly, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "You're a hard person to miss, Mrs. Hargrave." Evelyn's smile widened just a bit. "Perhaps we'll see each other again." "I hope so," Julian replied smoothly, watching as she walked gracefully toward the gallery's exit. As soon as she was out of sight, Julian exhaled, his heart racing with exhilaration. He had done it. He had gotten her attention, and better yet, she had seemed intrigued. The following Thursday, Julian returned to the gallery, hoping to cross paths with Evelyn again. This time, she greeted him with a knowing smile, and their conversation picked up as though no time had passed. As the weeks went by, their encounters became more frequent. They strolled through the gallery together, discussing art, life, and the intricacies of the world. Julian was careful not to reveal too much about himself. He didn't want her to know about his financial struggles or his lack of direction. Instead, he focused on making her feel like she was the center of his world. Soon enough, Evelyn invited Julian to her estate for one of her famous gatherings. This was exactly what he had been waiting for, the opportunity to enter her inner circle. When he arrived at her mansion, he was in awe of the grandeur. The estate was even more magnificent than he had imagined, with towering marble columns, lush gardens, and priceless art adorning every wall. The party itself was intimate, attended by only a few of Evelyn's closest friends, most of whom were older, wealthy socialites. Julian, ever the charmer, worked the room effortlessly, making small talk and impressing Evelyn's friends. But he always kept his focus on Evelyn, ensuring she felt his undivided attention. By the end of the evening, Julian had won over not just Evelyn, but also her circle of friends. As time passed, Julian found himself spending more and more time at Evelyn's estate. They would sit in her garden, sipping wine as the sun set, or take long walks around the sprawling grounds. He continued to play the role of the perfect suitor, and Evelyn seemed to grow fonder of him with each passing day. Julian's plan was working perfectly. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for, his own feelings. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. Julian, who had initially seen Evelyn as nothing more than a means to an end, found himself genuinely enjoying her company. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, witty, insightful, and confident. She had lived a full life and had a wealth of stories to tell. And despite the significant age difference, Julian found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they sat on Evelyn's balcony overlooking the gardens, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Julian," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Julian's heart raced. He had a feeling this conversation was coming, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Evelyn continued, her eyes searching his. "I've been around long enough to know when someone is being genuine and when they're not. You're a charming man, Julian, but I have to ask, why did you seek me out in the first place?" Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so careful, so calculated in his approach, but Evelyn had seen right through him. He could lie, of course, continue the charade, but something in her gaze stopped him. This was a woman who had lived through more than he could imagine, and she deserved more than another lie. Taking a deep breath, Julian met her gaze. "I won't lie to you, Evelyn. When I first approached you, it wasn't because of love or even friendship. I heard about your wealth, about your loneliness, and I thought I could take advantage of that." Evelyn's expression didn't change. She simply listened, her eyes never leaving his. Julian continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But something changed. The more time I spent with you, the more I realized that I wasn't playing a game anymore. I wasn't pretending to enjoy your company, I genuinely do. You're remarkable, Evelyn. And I'm ashamed of how I started this, but I need you to know that it's not about your fortune anymore. It's about you." For a long moment, there was silence. Julian braced himself for what he was sure would be her dismissal of him. He had expected her to see through him eventually, but he hadn't anticipated just how much it would hurt when she did. But then, to his surprise, Evelyn reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for being honest," she said softly. "And thank you for telling me now, before things went too far." Julian looked up, confused. "Does that mean?" Evelyn smiled, a small, sad smile. "It means that I understand. I've lived long enough to know that people are complicated, Julian. We're all driven by different things at different times in our lives. What matters is where we end up, not where we started." Julian felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I want to be with you, Evelyn," he said earnestly. "Not because of the money, not because of what you can give me, but because of who you are. I've never met anyone like you." Evelyn's smile widened, and for the first time, Julian saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Then let's see where this takes us," she said. The months that followed were unlike anything Julian had ever experienced. With the weight of his secret lifted, he allowed himself to fully immerse in his relationship with Evelyn. They spent their days together, exploring the city, hosting intimate gatherings at her estate, and enjoying each other's company in ways that felt natural and unforced. Julian no longer thought about her fortune or her social standing, he was simply happy to be with her. Evelyn, too, seemed to flourish. She had always been a strong, independent woman, but with Julian by her side, she found new energy, new excitement for life. Their connection was deep and genuine, built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and a love that transcended age or wealth. Julian's friends, who had once scoffed at the idea of him being with an older woman, began to see the change in him. He was no longer the restless, aimless man they had known. He had found purpose, direction, and, most importantly, love, and though Julian never forgot how their relationship had started, he no longer felt guilty. He knew that he had changed, that his feelings for Evelyn were real, and that they were building something beautiful together. In the end, Julian never needed to inherit Evelyn's fortune, because what they had was far more valuable than money. Their love was deep, true, and built on a foundation of trust and understanding. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, but it was real, and it was theirs, and so, they lived, not in perfect bliss, but in a love that carried them through the years, two souls once brought together by circumstance but bound by something far more profound, and that, for Julian, was the greatest fortune of all.